Welcome into the second lesson called The Most Important Chess Rule. In the first lesson of this video course, we were talking about the importance of the attack. However, not always there is any attacking move in your disposal. For instance, in the starting position of a chess game, definitely there is no way for you to attack. And even if we make one move or even a couple moves, there would still be no options for you on how you can possibly damage your opponent. What should you do in such cases? And by the way, this is the most common situation of a chess game, because even though attack is the greatest thing that you can do, but more often than not, there is no direct way to attack. So what should you be doing in such cases? And here comes the principle of the least active piece. It says, find the piece which is the least active and activate it, improve its position. It is very straightforward, and by following this single important chess principle, you can play a lot of moves within a chess game without really necessity to think hard about them. Like in this position, for instance. Well, we can notice that most of the white pieces are pretty passive, and still it's not totally true for each of them. For example, the white's bishop on c1 is already quite active, it controls the long diagonal. While the white's knights, they're totally passive. They're not doing anything, just as well as the other pieces. But for the knights, the good thing is that you can bring them into play in one move. And that is why that's exactly what you should be doing. Why I just played knight to f3. By the way, here we're analyzing the game between two amateur players. They're both around 2200 rated. So I just wanted to really take an example from an ordinary game, not from the world top level players, so that you can relate to it and you can see what are the good things that amateur players and club level players do and what are the mistakes that they play. Alright, let's go ahead with this game. Black played g6, white played c4, he's also trying to fight for the center. And after that, white played g3. Yeah, here there is also one important remark to be made. I'm talking about the pieces, as you may notice. I'm saying that you need to find the least active piece and activate it. Does that mean that you should never move your pawns? Well, not exactly. Just as you can see in this position, if white wants to bring his bishop from f1 into play, there is no way to do that other than moving a pawn. And that is what he did by pushing the pawn to g3 and therefore preparing development of the bishop to g2. And a similar thing happened with the dark squared bishop. This bishop was activated by making the pawn move to d4, which enabled the bishop to be developed along this diagonal. And therefore, we will be making pawn moves from time to time, but the purpose of those pawn moves would still be rather to activate your pieces. Alright, let's go ahead. Black played d6, white played bishop to g2. By the way, you can see that the interesting thing about this principle of the least active piece is that almost all of the white's moves are following just this one principle alone. Let's go ahead, white castled. Also the castles helps you to bring the rook into play and also to bring your king into safety, but even the primary purpose is just to help your rook take active part in the following stage of the game. By the way, you may be wondering, like, why do we have to come up with this standalone principle for the simple thing that usually people call development? They say that in an opening, you need to develop your pieces. And that is exactly true, but the purpose of stating the principle is that it is actually a wider rule. It's not only for the opening stage, it's for the entire game. In any stage of the game, you can follow the principle of the least active piece. And when you follow it in an opening, yes, it is called development. But you can as well follow it in the middle game and in the end game. It is a really universal thing. Alright, now let me ask you a question. Black just played c6, it is white to play. What would you play here? How would you play here? There are a couple pieces you need to develop. Like you can move your knight, for instance, your bishop, or maybe your queen. So which piece would you develop now? The answer to that question once again lies into the principle of the least active piece. You find the piece which is the least active and you move it. Now in the current position you can see that the bishop already controls the long diagonal, the queen already has some scope of activity, maybe not that huge, but anyway, and only the knight is doing absolutely nothing in its initial square, and therefore you gotta move the knight. And that also brings us to one more common rule of a chess game, which states that you should develop knights before bishops. That is a common rule stated by the second world champion last year, a long time ago, but now you can see that it is only a consequence of the principle of the least active piece. So white moved the knight, black played queen to c7, here white played pawn to h3. What do you think about this move, pawn to h3? Is this a good one, a bad one, or normal? Well, we said that in opening you need to follow the principle of the least active piece, and therefore develop your pieces. And the pawn moves are good when they prepare or support your development. In this case, the pawn move to h3 did not really prepare any kind of development for white, and that is why we may say that it is rather a waste of time. It's not that it damages white's position too much, it doesn't, but still it just wastes a little bit of time. So white could just go ahead instead and do all the moves that he are going to do without this pawn move to h3. Alright, let's go ahead. Black played knight to d7, white followed with e4, just to establish better control in the center. Black played pawn to e5, and white finally developed bishop to e3. Black played rook to e8, and now it is white to play. How would you play here as white? A lot of players here would start thinking what to do about those central pawns, like whether white should be taken on e5, or maybe white should instead push the pawn to d5 or do anything else. But now you know that you should be focusing on another thing in an opening. In an opening, just as well as oftentimes throughout the whole game, you should be focusing on the principle of the least active piece. So far, white has already brought all of his minor pieces into play, and now it is time for the heavy pieces, for the queen and the rooks. Now it's time to activate those pieces, and therefore white played queen to c2. In general, if you always keep following the principle of the least active piece in an opening stage, you can come up with a pattern, a plan of actions for an opening, for any opening that you play. Just like in this game, you may notice that first of all white developed his minor pieces, the knights and then the bishops. Those are the easiest pieces to be developed, and you can do that quickly. After that, you also castle your king. That is the next thing that you do. Well, oftentimes that goes along the way of development, the minor pieces. And finally, at the third stage, you develop your heavy pieces, the queen and the rooks. Why do you do that last of all? Well, first of all, as you may notice, like earlier, there is no way to develop this rook from a1 to bring it somewhere into play before you would develop the other pieces, such as the knight, which was standing here in the b1, the bishops here in c1, the queen here. So you gotta move the pieces, your own pieces, out of the way of the rook before you can move it somewhere. And that is why you have to develop it last of all. There is also one more reason, which just means that the heavy pieces are more valuable. And if you bring them into play too early, they can be attacked by an opponent. And that is why you have to be more cautious with moving your heavy pieces into an active play too early. Alright, so once again, just remember this plan of actions for an opening, for any opening that you play. Number 1, develop minor pieces. Number 2, castle. And number 3, connect the rooks. By saying connect the rooks, I mean that you're moving your queen. Like in this game we did it with the move queen to c2, which establishes the connection between both of your rooks. So they start somewhat looking at each other, be connected. And after doing so, you may say that the opening is finished for you, because you realized the main opening tasks, and you developed almost all of your pieces. Black played knight to f8, now it is white to play once again. What would you play here? What do you think? There is one more rule that you may remember. It says that you should move the piece that hasn't made any moves yet. It's just one more reminder for yourself to follow the principle of the least active piece, because usually the piece which was not moved yet in this game usually this piece is the least active. It doesn't take any part into play. And in this game, if you ask yourself, which of my pieces has not made any moves yet, you will notice that rook on a1, and therefore it's really time to bring it into play to join the body, and white plays rook to d1. Black answered bishop e6, that attacks the white's pawn on c4, so white should protect it. White played pawn to b3, and black played rook to d8. Alright, what should white be activating here? Very often, after you developed all of your minor pieces, you move the queen to connect the rooks. After that, oftentimes, you need to also bring your rooks into the center. Because still, even though the rook on f1, even though it made already one move when white did his castling, but still, standing on the f1, it does not do anything really. And therefore, very often we need to bring the rooks into the central lines. Because usually, both players are fighting for the control over the central squares. Like we can see it in this example, there is some tension between those central pawns, and therefore there is a greater chance that the central lines will be opened down the road. And in order to prepare yourself for that situation, it is advisable to place your rooks on the central lines. Alright, the next question is, how can you activate your rook on f1? Well, there are a couple options. The most straightforward option, and a good one, would be just to play rook to e1. That would be a good move, indeed. In the actual game, white did a little bit different thing. He played rook to d2. And by doing so, he's preparing to double rooks along the d-file, which is also a good idea. And here let me make another useful remark for you to remember. In opening, there is a rule which says, do not move the same piece twice. I hope that now it is pretty clear for you that, in fact, it's not even a standalone rule. It's just the same principle of the least active piece. Because moving the least active piece means that if you have a least active piece, like in this case that rook on f1, it means that you should take care of that rook instead of making the second move of the rook which was already developed. So generally speaking, you should not be moving the same piece twice. Instead of that, you should activate the least active piece, the piece which has not made any moves yet. But in this game, the move rook to d2 is totally fine, because the purpose of this move is only to bring the f1 rook into play. So white plays rook to d2 not because he wants to do anything about that rook on d2. He wants to bring the least active piece into play, and that is why it is a good move. Finally, here in this position, I just told you that there are a couple of good things that white could do. White could play rook to e1, which is a good option. White could play rook to d2 and then double rooks along the d-file. Which move is the best? Well, I can tell you that both of them are good. Chess is not a mathematical task where there is only one correct solution. Very often during a game of chess there are a number of moves and all of them are fine. So do not overcomplicate the situation for yourself, because I know that there are some players who really always try to figure out what is the best move, and they have to think hard for a long time trying to find the answer. Do not overcomplicate the situation for yourself. Just play normal moves, and if you know the principle, just follow it. And oftentimes there are many ways how you can follow the same correct principle. Like in this position, both of the moves of the white's rook would be fine. In the game, he'd chosen to play rook to d2. Black replied with a pawn move to h6. White continued with his plan. He played rook to d1. Black answered b6. And here there was the direct way for white to start attacking something. Remember, we talked about that in the previous lesson. You focus your attention on the opponent's half of the board and ask yourself how can you attack or take something there. And that is exactly what white did in this position. Once all of the white's pieces are developed, it is really time to start the attack. So he captured the pawn on e5, and he noticed that if he trades off all of the rooks there on the d8, that would leave the black's pawn on e5 unprotected, and therefore on the next move white could just grab it. White won the pawn, which is a material advantage, and a little later in this game he won the entire game. We will not analyze this game till the end. If you wish to see the continuation of the game, you can just see it in the PGN file. There you can find this whole game. But anyway, now you can just notice that in the entire game, that we have just analyzed, white simply followed the principle of the least active piece at every move. And that is why I say that it is the most common, the most important rule of chess, because it works probably more often than anything else in chess. Here is another game between Donner and Velimirovich, two strong grandmasters. In the previous example, we have seen how the principle of the least active piece works in an opening and a little bit in the middle game. But I've also told you that this is a universal principle that works in an endgame just as well. It works throughout the whole game. Therefore, now let's take a look at this example where it's already an endgame, but you can still apply just the same principle to find the right moves. It is white to play. How would you play here as white? Once again, you can think about the principle of the least active piece. And here we can see that white has only 3 pieces, 2 bishops and the king. And while the bishops are already doing some work, they're already controlling a number of squares, the king is totally passive. And therefore it is really time for white to bring the king into play, and that is exactly what he did by playing king to f2. That is a general rule which says, in an endgame, bring your king into play, centralize it. But as you can see, there is nothing new for you here, because it's just the principle of the least active piece. Like played bishop to f5, white moved his king forward to e3. In a middle game and in an opening, you gotta be careful with your king, because if you activate it, it can be checkmated by an opponent. But in an endgame, the opponent has too few pieces left on the board, there is no chance for him to checkmate your king, and therefore the king becomes an active piece, and you need to activate it just as you do it with any other piece that you have. Like played bishop e4, attacking two of the white's pawns, white continued with king to d4, supporting that pawn on d5, like capture the pawn. It was probably unnecessary for white really to sacrifice that pawn on g2, but anyway, he did that, and actually that still worked fine, just because white also took this time to do something very useful to activate his king. Now he went forward with king to e5, also attacking that knight on f6, like played king to g6, and the white king goes forward to d6. And now we can see that the king was really brought into play at a very fast pace. It was standing on the g1 doing nothing, and now it's super active on the d6, where it's ready to, let's say, go to c7, where it can attack the black's pawns of the queen side. It can also support an advancement of the white's passed pawn along the d file, and all in all, this king is now doing a great job. Black played king to f8. Alright, what would you play here? What do you think? In general, what should white be doing now? Well, we said that it's all the same stuff. Principle of the least active piece. The king is already active, but now it can't go forward anymore because it has to protect the pawn on d5, which is attacked by the two of the black's minor pieces. And therefore it's time for white to care about the rest of his pieces. The bishop on a2 also tied down to the defense of that pawn on d5, so there is not much you can do about that bishop. But the bishop on e1 definitely can be moved forward. So in general, that's what white should be doing. However, right now there is a bit of a tactical problem, because if you move the bishop somewhere, then in majority of the cases black will be able to reply with knight to e4 with a double attack of the white's king, and also attacking lots of the squares in the white's camp. And as you can see, those are the squares where the white's dark squared bishop can go to. And that is why white definitely want to be cautious not to lose the bishop due to double attack. In one of those cases, if the black's knight would jump to c3 ultimately, that would also hit the other bishop on a2. All in all, white decided to a little bit protect himself from those tactical threats, and he moved the bishop to b3. Black answered with g5, and here white was fine to play bishop to g3, activating the dark squared bishop. And after king to e8, white continued with bishop e5. Now the bishop was brought from e1 to e5 and became really active, like played knight to d7. And here, of course, we don't want to move back. Generally, we want to move forward, we want to activate our position. So white moved the light squared bishop to a4. Now the light squared bishop became more active as well. Black answered bishop h3 just to protect that knight on d7. Now the knight is pinned. White goes inside with bishop to f6, which also hits the pawn on g5. Again, the black's knight cannot move, can't do anything because it is pinned. In order to protect the pawn on g5, black played h6, and now you can just notice that black is totally paralyzed. Right? Went inside with king to c7, and there is just nothing black can do because his pieces are tied down to the defense of that knight on d7, and yeah, he's hopeless. He played bishop f5 because he has nothing to do anyway, and white simply grabbed the pawn, black removed the king, and here white just simplified the position. He took that knight and there took the pawn on a6, just because after that there is nothing black can do against the very straightforward threat of king goes to b7 and then the pawn goes all the way forward till it becomes a new queen. And therefore black resigned. In this example, you have seen how white gradually followed the principle of the least active piece in an endgame. First of all, he brought his king into play, and after that he improved the position of both his bishops, and that was enough to win the game. Conclusion. The best thing you can do in chess is to attack. If you can attack, do it. However, oftentimes there is no attacking move you can play. In this case, you need to activate your position and therefore prepare your attack in the future. One of the most fundamental principles for activating your position is the principle of the least active piece. It states, find your least active piece and improve its position. This is one of the most common, most universal chess principles that you can follow throughout your entire game. If you follow it in an opening, it creates sort of a plan of actions for you. Number 1, develop minor pieces, number 2, castle, and number 3, connect the rooks. The first two items oftentimes can be realized together, while developing the heavy pieces is always the last on your to-do list. There are also a few specific ideas that you can conclude out of the principle of the least active piece in an opening. One of them says develop knights before bishops, because oftentimes bishops are already active even on their original squares, while the knights need to be brought into play, therefore develop knights before bishops. Another rule, which is also only a consequence of the principle of the least active piece, states do not move the same piece twice in an opening. Again, it's because you want to activate your least active piece and not move again the piece which is already active. If we come to an endgame, the principle of the least active piece suggests that you activate your king, you centralize it. As you may notice, there are a number of the rules that you can conclude out of the principle of the least active piece, but there is no need for you to remember all those specifics. You just keep in mind the key takeaway, the principle of the least active piece. Find your least active piece and improve its position. If you follow this rule, it will help you play well in the vast majority of the chess positions. So now you know it, congratulations. This one principle alone makes you a lot stronger chess player.